Find the auction notice came 4 years before any of what I'm about to tell you, tacked crooked to the post outside the pound feed store, curling at one corner like it already knew it was wrong. I didn't stop to read it that morning. I know that now because Arlie Lawson has told the story so many times at the co-op counter that I could recite it back to him word for word, the way he tells it, the way he likes to tell it, with me standing there in my father's old canvas coat like I hadn't slept in 3 days, which I hadn't. But that's getting ahead of things, and my daddy always said a story told out of order is a story told wrong. So let me take you back to where it actually started, because you need to understand where I was standing before you'll understand why I did what I did. I was 41 years old, and I had just buried the last of them. Ira went first. 3 years before that morning at the feed store, his heart giving out in the milking shed on a Tuesday in October with the fog still sitting low over the ridge, I found him with his hand still on the rail, like he just needed to sit a minute. I keep that morning folded up small and put away somewhere I don't visit often. My daddy Grover had gone 6 years before Ira, slower, the kind of going that gives you time to say things and still leaves you feeling like you didn't say enough. He died in the front room of the house he built with his own hands, the blackjack place, 200 acres of Pound, Virginia dirt that his daddy had cleared and that he had worked every day of his life like it owed him something back. And never did. Not really. Not the way he wanted. I don't have children. I want to say that plain right at the start, because you'll hear people in this county talk about the Coleman girl and her boy or her daughter that moved off to Bristol, and none of that is true, and I won't have it said about me, even in a story, even in somebody else's mouth. There is no child. There was supposed to be, once, a long time ago, and there wasn't. And that's a grief that belongs to me and Ira and nobody else, and I'll leave it there. What there was when I stood in that county assessor's office on a grey Tuesday morning with my hands still smelling of the coffee I'd burned making Grover's grave marker order was a piece of paper telling me I owed $1,140 in back taxes on 200 acres nobody in 3 counties wanted. The clerk, a woman named Odessa Puckett, who'd known my mother, slid the paper across the counter without quite looking at me. "You could let it go, Icie," she said. "The county'd take it, nobody'd think less of you." I folded the paper along its crease and put it in my coat pocket, the same coat pocket where I kept my daddy's notebook, though I didn't tell her that. "I'm not letting it go," I said. She looked at me then, the way people in Pound had started looking at me since Ira died, that particular blend of pity and waiting, like they expected me to fold up any day and move to be near my sister in Kingsport. "It's not good ground, honey. Your daddy near killed himself trying to make that wee pound." "I know what he tried," I said. "I was there. I was there for all of it. That's the part nobody in this story gets right when they tell it after. The part I want you to hold on to before we go any further. I wasn't some fool who wandered onto that land with a notion. I grew up walking every fence line of the blackjack place behind my daddy, watching him fight that thin red clay season after season, watching the wheat come up patchy and pale where the ground had been worked too hard for too long, going back to when his own daddy first put a plough to it. Wheat. The way the Plains folks did it, the way everybody around Pound had always done it because that's what the land had given before, back when it still had something to give. Grover kept at it out of loyalty more than sense, I think now. Like changing the crop would have been admitting his daddy was wrong, or that the land itself had changed underneath all of them and nobody wanted to say so out loud. The morning I stood in that assessor's office, I hadn't decided anything yet. I want to be honest about that. I paid the $1,140 out of the little bit Ira's life insurance had left after the funeral, and after 4 years of taxes, I'd been scraping together alone. And I walked back out to my truck without a plan in my head beyond keeping the ground in the family one more year. It was the notebook that changed that. It always comes back to the notebook. Found Grover kept it in the drawer of the hall table his whole life, a black composition book with the corners gone soft and grey from handling, and I'd seen him write in it 1,000 times without ever once asking what it said, because that's how you are with your daddy's private things when you're young. You let them be private. It wasn't until I was going through the house that winter, boxing up what I could bear to box and leaving the rest for later, that I finally sat down at that same hall table and opened it. Most of it was what you'd expect. Rainfall by the week, going back to 1960, which field got manure and which got left. A running argument with himself in his own cramped hand about whether the bottom 40 needed lime again, but near the back, in ink gone brown with age, there were 4 pages that weren't about wheat at all. They were about a stand of mesquite he'd seen on a trip down to West Texas in 1968, visiting a cousin who'd gone out there for cattle work, and how he couldn't get it out of his head, how that scrub timber held green through a drought that killed everything around it for 100 miles, how the roots on those trees went down further than any well he'd ever dug, he'd written. And I read this line so many times since that I could say it in my sleep. a tree that goes looking for water instead of waiting on the sky might be the only honest crop left. Found he never planted it. He wrote 2 more pages of figures, what it might cost, what the county extension man would say, what the neighbours would say, and then he stopped, and the notebook went back to rainfall and lime. I think about that a lot. I think he was afraid. I think when I finally understood what those 4 pages meant, I was afraid too, and it made me love him different than I had before. Seeing him scared on paper like that, seeing him back away from the one idea he'd never let go of, I didn't back away. I want to tell you that wasn't bravery, not at first. It was more that I didn't have anything left to lose that hadn't already been taken, and there is a particular kind of freedom in that. A hard, cold freedom that nobody would wish on themselves, but that I have come to be grateful for since. If the ground failed, I'd lose ground that was already failing. If I stayed the same, I'd lose it slower, but I'd still lose it. Taxes eating at what Ira's insurance left until there was nothing, and the county took it anyway. I called a man at the extension office in late January, a soft-spoken fellow named Coy Napier who'd helped Grover with soil tests 20 years before and remembered him fondly. And I asked him what he knew about honey mesquite and whether it would grow in Wise County clay. He was quiet on the phone a long moment. Icie, he said, that's a desert tree, West Texas, New Mexico. I don't know that anybody's tried it up here. Find. I know it's not been tried, I said. I'm asking if it can be done, not if it's been done. He sent me what he had, some bulletins, a name of a nursery down in Uvalde that dealt in drought hardy stock. A warning kindly meant that I ought to think hard before I sank money into something so far outside what the ground around here had ever grown. I thanked him and I thought hard, the way he said, for about 2 weeks. Then I drove to the bank. The loan officer at the county bank was a young man, new to the branch, and he looked at my application with the particular blankness of somebody who has been trained not to laugh in a customer's face. $16,000 for 200 acres of ground the county already had on its delinquent list to plant a tree that, as far as he or anybody in that building knew, had never once grown east of the Mississippi outside somebody's front yard as an ornamental. I watched him read the word mesquite on the application twice, like it might change into something more reasonable the second time. Mrs. Coleman, he said, I have to ask, is there a conventional plan here? Something the bank's more familiar backing? The conventional plan is what killed that ground, I said. My daddy tried the conventional plan for 40 years. He didn't laugh to his credit. He just looked tired, the way men that age look when they're about to say no to a widow and would rather not have to. But the loan went through. In the end, not because he believed in mesquite trees, but because the blackjack place itself stood as collateral, and because I think somewhere in the paperwork, somebody decided that a woman fool enough to ask for it was a woman fool enough to actually try, and trying, even foolish trying, still counted as intent to repay. Found I signed the papers on a Thursday in February, $16,000 against 200 acres and whatever was left of my good name in this county, and I drove home with my daddy's notebook on the seat beside me like it was riding shotgun, like some part of him was there approving, or maybe just watching to see if I'd finish what he'd started and lost his nerve on. Arlie Lawson found out before I'd even gotten the receipt from the nursery. Find, I don't know how word travelled so fast. I suspect the loan officer's wife did some of the travelling, or maybe it was the seed company's driver who talked to everybody along his route, whether they wanted talking to or not. But by the following Saturday, when I walked into the feed store for chicken scratch and fence wire, the whole counter went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet, when everyone in it has already discussed you at length before you arrived. Found, Arlie was 58 years old that year, and he farmed the 400 acres next to mine, wheat mostly, the way his daddy had and his daddy's daddy before that, and he had a voice made for the back of a church, big and carrying and sure of itself. He was leaning on the counter with his hat pushed back, and when he saw me come in, he didn't even wait for me to get to the register. Well, here she is, he said loud enough that old Mr. Stiltoner 2 aisles over stopped what he was doing. Found, the blackjack cactus farmer. A couple of the younger men laughed, the kind of laugh men do when they're not sure if it's funny, but they know Arlie Lawson wants it to be. I kept walking toward the counter, my chin level, the way my mother taught me to walk into any room where I already knew what was waiting. Found, it's mesquite, Arlie, not cactus, I said. But I don't expect the difference matters much to you. $16,000, he said, shaking his head like he was talking to the ceiling instead of me. $16,000 on top of what your daddy already put in the ground and pulled nothing back out of to plant a Texas desert bush on Wise County clay. I heard it from Dewey at the bank. I like to fell over. You heard wrong if you heard it was a bush, I said. It's a tree, goes down 40, 50 feet for water, doesn't need what wheat needs. It's not going to need what wheat, because it's not going to grow, he said, and now he wasn't performing for the room anymore. Or not only that, there was something almost kind underneath it, the kind of cruelty that thinks of itself as concern. I liked Grover, I liked Ira. I'm telling you this as your neighbour and not as a man trying to make sport of a grieving woman. That ground has grown wheat for 80 years because wheat is what that ground grows. You're about to lose the last of what your family built chasing something you saw in a magazine. I didn't see it in a magazine, I said. I didn't tell him where I'd seen it. That wasn't his to have. I appreciate the neighbouring, Arlie. I'll let you know how the cactus does. I paid for my chicken scratch and my fence wire and I walked out with the whole store watching me go, and I did not let my shoulders drop until I was in the truck with the door shut. And even then, I only allowed it a minute because there was planting to do and daylight was already spending itself, and I did not have time that year or any year after to sit still and feel what people wanted me to feel. Whenever found, the nursery truck came from Uvalde 10 days later, 1,100 honey mesquite seedlings packed root and all in damp burlap, and I planted every one of them myself, row by row, walking the 200 acres with my daddy's notebook in my coat pocket and his handwriting in my head telling me how deep, how far apart, how much water to give them that first hard month before their roots found what they were looking for on their own. Nobody helped me. That's not entirely true. I should say it different. Nobody helped me who I hadn't already lost, and the ones I hadn't lost yet weren't offering. Grover, that's who I hadn't lost yet in the way that mattered, except he'd been gone 9 years, and the notebook was as close as I could get to him now. His handwriting slanted hard to the right, like he was always in a hurry to get to the next thought before it left him, and on the page marked April he'd written water deep, not often, and let the roots go looking. Underlined twice, the way he underlined the things he wanted me to remember after he couldn't tell me himself. I did what the page said. I carried 5-gallon buckets from the branch behind the barn because the well pump wasn't rigged that far out yet. I watered each seedling once and then made myself walk away and not water it again for 11 days, even when the ground cracked pale around the base and every instinct in me said a plant needs water, same as a person needs air. Ira used to tease me for fussing over things that didn't need fussing. The garden, the porch rail, him, and I heard his voice do it now, standing over those seedlings with my knuckles white on the bucket handle, wanting so bad to pour. Found. That was the whole of it. That first month, not pouring. The blackjack place had been Coleman ground since Grover's daddy bought it off a widow in 1958 for less than it was worth even then, on account of the wheat never did what wheat was supposed to do on that dirt. Thin harvests, brittle stalks, 3 bad years out of every 5 where the crop came in so light it barely paid the diesel to cut it. Grover kept planting wheat anyway, because that's what the ground around Pound had always grown, and a man doesn't go against 80 years of neighbours just because his own 200 acres never got the memo. He died still rotating wheat and fallow, still hoping the next year would be the one, and I'd watched him hope himself old doing it. That was the debt this dirt owed somebody. The way I saw it, not money, faith spent and never paid back. I wasn't going to keep making that payment. Found the magazine. I never told Arlie, but I'll tell it now, the way I tell everything. Straight was a university extension bulletin Ira brought home from a machinery auction in Wise County, tucked under a stack of parts catalogues, the kind of thing a man picks up because it's free and there's a picture of a tractor on it he likes. It wasn't about Mesquite exactly, it was about root systems, about a researcher down at Texas A&M measuring how deep different range plants could pull water, and there was one line in there, plain as Grover's handwriting, that said, honey mesquite roots have been recorded past 150 feet in search of groundwater. I read that line maybe 30 times over a winter with Ira 6 months dead and the notebook in my lap and Grover's own words on caliche and clay staring back at me from the facing page like the two of them. My husband's magazine and my daddy's notebook had been having a conversation I only just walked in on. 150 feet. Our well went 60. I didn't sleep the night. I understood what that meant. Everybody around Pound was farming the top 18 inches, fighting the same 18 inches every summer, praying over the same 18 inches every July when the rain quit. And under all of it, past where anybody's plough or anybody's prayer could reach, there was water still down there, the whole time, waiting on something with the patience and the reach to go get it. That's the loop I never told Arlie about, standing in his store with my chicken scratch and my fence wire. He thought I'd gone soft in the head from grief and a magazine picture. He didn't know I'd done the arithmetic on how many wheat years it would take before there wasn't a Coleman left on this land to argue with him at all. Found the 11 days ended, and I watered again, and this time when I walked the rows I saw it, not much, just a stiffening in the little grey-green leaves, a colour that hadn't been there before, something that looked less like a plant hanging on and more like a plant deciding to stay. I got down on my knees in the dirt in my church dress because I hadn't had time to change, and I dug my fingers in 1 inch, 2 inches, feeling for what Grover's notebook called the taproot's first commitment, and there it was, thin as a shoelace, and already harder than it had any right to be after 5 weeks in the ground. I sat back on my heels and I cried for the first time since Ira's funeral. Not sad crying. The other kind, the kind that comes up out of you when something you've been carrying alone finally sets its own weight down for a minute. Then I got up because there were 900 more seedlings that hadn't been checked yet and the light wasn't going to hold forever. Found Burnham Newsom's name I didn't know yet. That spring, I want to say that plain because it would be easy to tell this story like I saw him coming, like I planted honey mesquite on 200 acres with a buyer's face already fixed in my mind. I didn't. I planted it because the notebook said the roots would find water nobody else's crop could reach, and because a stubborn woman with a dead husband and a dead father and a banknote coming due in 18 months doesn't have the luxury of planting for anything but survival. Whatever Burnham Newsom wanted with mesquite wood, whatever men out of Udall or San Antonio were paying for it that year, none of that had crossed my mind. I wasn't dreaming about smokehouse lumber and flooring contracts. I was dreaming about not losing my daddy's ground to a bank that would sell it to somebody who'd never once walked it barefoot to check if the dew was heavy enough to skip watering. The first summer nearly took it all back from me anyway. Fine, June came in dry and July came in worse. A heat that sat on the county like a hand pressing down, and by the third week I walked out one morning to find whole rows of seedlings gone, the colour of a paper sack left in the sun. Not green anymore, not even grey-green, just spent, curled in on themselves like something had reached down and wrung them. I counted before I let myself feel anything about it, because that's how Grover taught me to take bad news, counting first, feeling after 211 dead out of 1,100, nearly 1 in 5. $16,000 doesn't divide evenly across 1,100 seedlings, but I did that arithmetic anyway, standing in the row with the sun already ironing the back of my neck at 7 in the morning. And I came up with a number for what was lying dead at my feet that made my knees go loose under me. I did not sit down. I want that on the record, even if nobody's asking. I did not sit down in that row and let the county's opinion of me finish the job the heat had started. But I stood there long enough that a man could have driven by and seen a woman standing dead still in a field of dead plants. And if that man had been Arlie Lawson, he'd have had exactly the picture he wanted, the one that proved him right, without him having to say another word. Founding went back to the notebook that night, and it took 2 hours by lamplight to find the page, because Grover's system wasn't a system so much as a conversation with himself, but I found it. First-year losses, if planted deep summer, are not a verdict, they're a filter. The weak ones go, don't replant in fear. Watch what's left and let it teach you what it needed. I read that line and I hated my father a little. In the specific way you hate somebody who's right and gone and can't be argued with. I wanted him to have written something else. I wanted a guarantee. He'd left me a filter instead, so I didn't replant in fear. I let the dead ones lie, and I walked every row that was left, 889 seedlings, checking which ones stood up straightest to the evening light, which ones had put their strength low instead of tall. And I started keeping my own notes in the back pages of Grover's book in my own hand, slanting the opposite way his did, like the two of us were arguing across time about which direction a person ought to lean when they're in a hurry. Fine. That was the week I let myself ask the question I hadn't let myself ask before, not out loud, not even alone in the truck where nobody could hear me be afraid. What if Arlie's right? What if I've spent Ira's insurance money and Grover's whole inheritance and 18 months of the only time I had to fix this? Chasing a line in a magazine that some professor wrote about ground 200 miles from Pound, ground that never had my daddy's caliche shelf sitting 11 feet down waiting to turn every root sideways. I sat in the truck outside the blackjack place with the engine off and the heat still coming up off the hood in waves, and I let myself feel the whole weight of that, maybe the banknote and the 200 dead-eyed seedlings and my father-in-law 2 rooms away in the house, not yet ready to say a kind word to me about any of it. And for about the length of one hymn, I actually sang it quiet to myself because that's what my mother did in hard rooms. I believed I might have ruined us. Then I got out of the truck because believing a thing for the length of a hymn and living your life by it are 2 different disciplines, and my mother taught me both and taught me which one to choose. Found the garden gate creaked when I came through it, and there on the back step, waiting the way he'd taken to waiting most evenings that summer without saying why, sat my father-in-law whittling a scrap of cedar into nothing in particular, the way idle hands do when a man is too proud to say he's worried. He didn't ask about the dead rows. He'd already ridden past them himself that afternoon on the mare, I found out later, and counted them the same as I had. He just looked up at me, dirt on my church dress, still from 3 weeks back, root stain on my hands that hadn't washed clean since April, and he said the thing he'd been saying all spring in one form or another, only quieter this time, like some of the certainty had gone out of it. Wheat never asked this much of anybody. I didn't answer him. I went inside and put the coffee on. because there were still 678 seedlings standing up straight in the last of that evening light. And doubt, I'd learned from my father, same as Faith, doesn't get to eat first at my table. Fine, by the second week of that summer, I'd stopped counting the mockery and started counting rows instead, because a row you can measure and a man's laugh you can't. 678 seedlings, and every one of them had a name in my head, even if I never said it out loud. On account of my mother teaching me that a thing loved by name grows different than a thing just tended, Grover's notebook stayed in the truck cab, wrapped in a feed sack against the dust, and I'd pull it out at the end of each row to check his marks against what I was seeing in the dirt, the way he'd drawn little arrows for where the water table sat deep under the old blackjack place, deeper than anybody in Pound had bothered to dig for in 30 years, because wheat don't ask a man to go that far down. Arlie Lawson found a new joke every week. That was his gift, if you could call it one, turning a woman's ruin into material for the feed store counter. Coleman's growing fence posts, he told anybody who'd listen, loud enough that I heard it walking in for salt blocks, paid $16,000 for kindling. A ripple of laughter went round the counter, the kind that don't need much fuel once it's lit. I bought my salt blocks. I didn't answer him. Behind me, I heard the counterman, Dewey, say, low, not to me, but not to me either. 16,000's a lot of kindling, Arlie, and that was as close to a friend as I had in that room, a man just barely not laughing along. Find what none of them knew, because I hadn't told a soul but the bank, was that the 16,000 wasn't the whole of it. There was still land clearing to pay off from the spring, still the well repair on the south pump that Ira had put off for 2 years before he died and left me to inherit along with everything else nobody wanted, and still $435 sitting in a coffee can on the kitchen shelf. That was every bit of cash money I had that wasn't already spoken for by somebody with a stamp and a signature. Grover's father-in-law money is what my own daddy used to call an emergency fund, and I was down to the can. I didn't tell Vernon that, my father-in-law, because Vernon had opinions enough about the 16,000 without knowing how thin the ice under it really was. Found Vernon Coleman had lived in that house longer than I had, in a manner of speaking. He'd been born 2 rooms over from where he slept now, in the same bed his wife Opal died in 4 winters back, and when Ira passed I'd asked him to stay because a house that empty scares a person worse than one that's crowded with an old man's opinions. He kept a Bible open on the side table to Ecclesiastes, a chapter about times and seasons, and I used to think it was habit until I noticed he read the same 3 verses over and over, the ones about a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, like he was working an argument against me out of scripture itself. Wheat's what my father grew, he told me more than once, tapping the page like it settled things. Wheat's what his father grew. The Coleman name was stitched into 100 years of gold stalks bending the same direction every August, and here I was, tearing that up for a shrub that took 4 years just to decide if it wanted to live. Found the wilting started on a Tuesday, though I didn't let myself call it that at first. I called it stress, called it transplant shock, called it anything but what it was, which was 200 of the youngest plants along the ridge line curling their leaves inward like a hand closing into a fist. I walked that ridge every morning before the heat came up, boots already dark with dew, checking each one, and by Friday the fist had closed on nearly all 200, and I stood there with Grover's notebook open to a page about deep taproots needing a full season of stress before they'd send anything worthwhile down past the hard pan, and for the first time since I'd signed the cheque, I let the fear all the way in. What if the notebook was wrong? What if my father-in-law's Ecclesiastes had more truth in it than a dead man's shorthand? What if I had taken every dollar between me and disaster and buried it in ground that had already told 200 plants no? Found that was the week my niece Llewellyn came out from Pound proper, 17 and sharp-tongued in a way I liked, home from her aunt's for the summer with nothing better to do than help an old woman she wasn't even bloodkin to plant trees, nobody believed in, she wasn't mine, never had children of my own. Ira and I hadn't been given that particular grace. But Llewellyn had taken to riding out on Saturdays anyway, first out of boredom, and then, I came to understand, because she'd overheard her own daddy laughing about me at a barbecue, and it had put something stubborn in her. She knelt down next to me at the wilted row, dug her fingers into the dirt an inch below where the mulch line sat, and said, "It ain't dry down here, Miss Icie. It's dry on top and wet underneath. That's not thirst, that's shock." She was right, and I hadn't looked, because fear makes a person stop checking the thing they're most afraid to find, and it took a girl of 17 to remind me that Grover's own hand had written exactly that, 2 pages back, in a margin I'd skipped past 3 times without reading close enough. Found I sat back on my heels in that row with the notebook in my lap and Llewellyn watching me, and I let myself say the doubt out loud for the first time to her because she was young enough not to carry it back to town as gossip. What if they're right, I said. What if I've put every dollar I've got into ground that's going to give me nothing back but a story for Arlie to tell at the counter for the next 20 years? Llewellyn didn't answer right off. She pulled a leaf off the nearest seedling, rolled it between her fingers, held it up so I could see the thin white line still running down its spine, green under green. Dead things don't hold colour like that, she said. This is waiting, not dying. My granddaddy used to say the same thing about corn during a drought year. Looks dead standing up, ain't dead till it's brown clean through. I didn't know where a 17-year-old had learned to talk like an old dry land farmer, but I took it the way you take any mercy that shows up uninvited, with both hands and no questions. Find word of the wilted rose got back to Vernon before I'd said a word to him, because word gets back in pound faster than weather does. He was on the porch when I came up from the ridge that evening, whittling that same scrap of cedar down toward nothing, and he didn't look up when he said it. Heard your trees are dying, not a question. I stood at the bottom of the steps with dirt to my elbows and Llewellyn's borrowed courage still warm in my chest, and I said, heard wrong, they're waiting. He made a sound in his throat that wasn't agreement and wasn't quite argument either, just an old man's noise, for I'll believe it when I see it, and went back to his cedar, and I went inside to put supper on, because a woman can be right and still have to feed the man who doubts her. Found the banknote came due the first week of August, and I drove into town with the coffee can money and what the summer's little jobs had brought in, mending fence for the Hastings place, selling 3 calves I hadn't planned on selling, and it covered exactly enough to keep current, not $1 more. Lloyd Pruitt at the bank counted it out twice, the way a man does when he's hoping the second count will be kinder than the first, and told me the note would need addressing again come fall, and something in the way he said it, careful, almost apologetic, told me he didn't expect I'd have an answer for him then either. I drove home past the Lawson place, past Arlie's wheat standing gold and tall, and exactly the way his daddy's had stood, exactly the way mine would have stood if I'd done what a Coleman was supposed to do. And I did not stop singing under my breath the whole way home, though it wasn't a hymn this time, it was just noise. The kind you make to keep from thinking too hard about a number that doesn't add up yet. Found by the middle of August, the sky had turned the colour of an old dish rag and stayed that way for going on 3 weeks, not a cloud with any intention behind it. And I started hearing a new kind of talk at the feed store, quieter than Arlie's jokes, worried talk, men asking each other how deep the wheat's roots would go before this one broke. I didn't join those conversations, I didn't need to. I already knew how deep wheat's roots went, because Grover had written it in the margin across from the Mesquite page, comparing the two like a man building a case for a jury only he could see. 18 inches, maybe 2 feet in good soil, no deeper, because wheat was never bred to outlast a Texas hill country drought. It was bred to outrun a Great Plains winter. Different fight, different weapon. Found. The morning the county extension man's truck came up the drive unannounced, I thought at first it was trouble. Some notice about the well, some complaint filed by a neighbour who didn't care for what I was doing with 200 acres he could see from his porch. Instead, it was a young fellow named Purcell, clipboard in hand, telling me he'd heard through the co-op that somebody out past Pound was running an unusual planting, and he wondered if he could walk the rows and take some soil readings, strictly for his own reports. I said yes before I'd finished hearing the question, because a stranger with instruments asking to look at my trees felt, for the first time in months, less like exposure and more like a chance at proof that didn't come out of my own mouth. He knelt in the dirt where Llewellyn had knelt, pushed a probe down 18 inches, then 30, then 40, calling out numbers to himself I didn't understand yet. And when he stood up and wiped his hands on his trousers, he said mostly to himself, "Moisture's holding clean down past 3 feet here. That's not luck. Whatever's down there is finding water your neighbour's ground gave up on years back." I didn't say I told them so because I hadn't told anybody anything yet, not with proof, but I felt Grover's notebook in the truck cab like it had grown a pulse. Found that was the loop I carried through the last hard weeks of that summer, not whether the trees would live, because Purcell's readings and Llewellyn's green under green had settled that argument in my own chest, even if Pound hadn't heard the verdict yet, but whether I'd still have the note paid and the roof over Vernon's head and mine by the time the rest of the county found out I'd been right. Being right and being solvent were 2 different disciplines too, same as believing and living, and my daddy hadn't taught me a shortcut between them. I still didn't know, standing in that dry August dust with the sky the colour of old dishwater, whether the mesquite would finish what it started before the bank finished with me. I only knew the fist-curled leaves had opened back up, green and stubborn, same as I intended to be. Purcell came back twice more before the leaves turned, each time with a different reason that wasn't really the reason. Once he said he wanted a soil sample from the North Fence line for a report he was writing on drought recovery in the Ridge counties. Once he just said he was passing through and wanted to see how the trees had taken the dry spell. Both times he knelt in the same spot Llewellyn had knelt. Both times he called out numbers I still didn't fully understand, and both times he left quieter than he'd arrived, like a man revising something in his head he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. I didn't push him. My daddy used to say a man who's still chewing on a thought will spit it out when it's ready, and pushing him just makes him swallow it whole and choke on it later. So I fed Purcell coffee and let him walk my rows and kept Grover's notebook in the truck cab where I could touch the cover if I needed to. Found the banknote came due the first week of September, and I want to tell it straight because there wasn't anything dramatic about it. No scene, no shouting. I drove into Pound with the payment in an envelope, and the same teller who'd slid my loan papers across the counter with his mouth pressed thin the year before took the envelope from me without a word about Mesquite or wisdom or waste. He just counted it, stamped it, and told me to have a good afternoon. That was the whole transaction. Found. But I sat in the truck afterward with my hands on the wheel for longer than I needed to, because paying that note on time out of egg money and garden money and the little bit Vernon's disability check could spare felt like something Grover would have wanted me to notice. He always said the difference between a farmer and a gambler was that a farmer paid what he owed on the day it was owed, win or lose, and let the land answer for the rest. Found it. Was Arlie Lawson who broke first, and it happened the way most true things happen around here, not in front of a crowd, but in the feed aisle at the co-op, where nobody's performing for anybody. I was loading a sack of chicken scratch into my truck bed when he came around the corner of the building with a bag of his own, and he stopped like he'd walked into a fence post. He didn't say anything for a second. Found. Then he said, Icie, just my name flat, like he was testing whether it still worked between us. Arlie, I said back and kept loading. Found Purcell's been out to my place too, he said, asking about my wheat yields the last 3 years. I told him what everybody knows. Dry falls, take a chunk, wet springs take a chunk, and you make do with what the Lord leaves you. He shifted the sack on his shoulder. Then he told me what your ground's been doing, moisture holding at 3 foot when mine's dust at 8 inches, root mass under those honey locust trees of yours, doing something he called hydraulic lift, pulling water up at night and sharing it out to whatever's growing near it. He said the word hydraulic like it was foreign in his mouth, and it probably was. I told him that couldn't be right. He said he'd run the numbers twice. I didn't say anything. I'd learned that from watching my daddy handle men who were working their way toward an apology. You let them walk the whole road themselves. You don't meet them halfway and rob them of the words. I've farmed this ridge 31 years, Arlie said, and his voice had gone quieter than I'd ever heard it. Quieter than the day he stood in the store and called my trees a coffin for cash. My daddy farmed it before me wheat, same as the plains always did it, because that's what this ground was for. Nobody ever told me different, and I never asked. He looked past me out toward the road that ran to the blackjack place, like he could see the trees from where he stood, even though he couldn't. I laughed at you in front of half the county. Icie, I want you to know I've thought on that more than once this summer, watching my own wheat come up thin and yours standing green when the rain skipped us twice. Found. You weren't wrong to worry, I told him, because it was true, and because there wasn't any good served in making him carry more than he'd already picked up on his own. Wheat's fed this county 100 years. I wasn't laughing at wheat when I planted those trees. I was just listening to a dead man who'd looked at this dirt longer than either one of us has been alive. He nodded slow, and I could see him working something loose in his chest, some old certainty he'd carried since his own daddy first put a hand on his shoulder and told him how the world worked. Would you let me walk it? He said finally. The Mesquite ground. I'd like to see it for myself, not from Purcell's numbers. Come Sunday afternoon, I said, after church before dark. He came. He walked the rows slow, the way a man walks when he's not sure he trusts his own feet on ground. That's proven him wrong. And he put his hand flat against the bark of one of the older trees, the way you'd touch a horse you weren't sure of yet. He didn't say much that day either, but he came back twice more before frost, and the second time he brought a sack of his own wheat seed and asked, quiet, almost embarrassed by the asking, whether he thought the north end of his own place, the part that had never grown much of anything worth cutting, might take to something besides wheat. I told him what Grover's notebook told me, that you don't fight ground, you ask it what it already wants to be, and then you get out of its way. Find. The word about Purcell's numbers moved through Pound the way water moves through a dry creek bed after the first real rain. Slow at first, then all at once, filling every low place it could find. By the time the leaves were down and the frost had put the county to sleep for the winter, 3 more men had come around asking, careful, like they were approaching a stray dog they weren't sure of whether I'd talk to them about the trees. I didn't crow about it. I didn't need to. Grover always said the land does the arguing for you if you just give it time enough, and he was right about that, same as he was right about the Mesquite. It was late October, the air gone sharp and the persimmons finally sweet on the trees down by the creek, when Burnham Newsom's truck came up the drive a second time, and this time he didn't get out slow and careful the way he'd had that first hot morning. He got out fast with a folder under his arm and a look on his face like a man who's found something he'd stopped expecting to find. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, "I've had 3 buyers on the phone this month asking after drought-tolerant forage and timber stock. And every one of them wants to know why I haven't already got a contract with the woman growing it 40 miles from my own back door." He set the folder on the tailgate of my truck and opened it right there, without ceremony. "The way you'd show a neighbour a good crop rather than a stranger. A deal. I want the whole 200 acres under contract, standing purchase, 5 years, renewable. I'll have my own men handle the harvest cutting, so you're not carrying that labour alone, and I'll pay you a rate now that I'd have laughed out of my own office 18 months ago." Found the figure he named, sat me down harder than I meant to sit, right there on my own tailgate, with Ira's name still carved into my chest where it always lived, and Grover's notebook not 2 feet away in the truck cab. It wasn't a fortune, it wasn't the kind of number that changes a woman's whole life in one signature, but it was enough to clear what was left on the note, enough to fix the roof over the kitchen that had been dripping into a coffee can for 2 winters, enough to know that whatever came next, drought or flood or another hard year, I wasn't standing on the edge of losing the blackjack place the way I had been standing the day I first walked those rows with Grover's notebook in my hand and nothing but stubbornness to go on. Arlie was there the day I signed it, not because he had any part in the deal, but because he'd taken to stopping by most Sundays by then. The way old habits reform themselves into new ones without much fanfare. He stood off to the side while Newsom and I went over the papers at the kitchen table, and when it was done, when the ink was dry and Newsom had shaken my hand and driven off satisfied, Arlie stayed a minute longer than usual. "Found I owe you an apology," he said, "and I know I already gave you half of one back at the co-op. But I want to say the rest of it plain so you've got it and don't have to wonder. I stood in front of the whole county and called what you were doing foolish. I said it because it scared me. Watching a widow bury money and grind, I didn't understand. Doing something none of us had ever tried, it was easier to laugh than to sit with not knowing. I'm sorry for the laughing, and I'm sorrier for how long it took me to walk out here and look for myself. I didn't gloat. There wasn't any pleasure in it. Not the kind of pleasure folks might expect from a woman who'd been laughed at in front of half the county and lived to see the laughing turn to asking. What I felt, standing in my own kitchen with the papers signed and the light going gold through the window the way it does in late October, was something closer to peace than triumph. "You don't owe me anything, Arlie," I told him. "I didn't win against you or against anybody who laughed. I won with the ground. Grover's the one who saw it, years before I ever put a shovel in the dirt. All I did was trust a dead man's handwriting over a living room full of doubt." He nodded, and something in his face eased, the way a man's face eases when he's finally allowed to stop carrying a thing he's been holding too tight for too long. "Your father-in-law," he said, careful, because he knew the shape of that particular grief in this house better than most, having watched it from the road for 2 years. "Did he ever come around?" I thought about Vernon, out on the porch that evening with his coffee, the same porch where he'd stood the first week and told me I was burying good money in bad ground, the same man who still muttered now and then about wheat and how things used to be done. He hadn't said he was sorry, not in so many words, not the way Arlie just had. Vernon wasn't built for words like that, but he'd started walking the rows with me some mornings, quiet, hands behind his back, and just once, he'd picked up one of the honey locust pods that had dropped in the yard and turned it over in his fingers, like he was reading something written on it in a language he was only starting to learn. That was Vernon's apology, as much of one as he had in him, and I'd learned to take it for what it was worth, which was plenty. "He's coming around," I said, "in his own way, on his own time, same as the rest of the county." Found that winter. I sat at the kitchen table most evenings with Grover's notebook open in front of me. Not because I needed to check anything anymore. I knew those rows now the way you know the sound of your own house settling at night, but because it felt right to keep it close, the same way you keep a photograph close even after the person in it is only a memory. I copied out a few pages into a fresh notebook of my own, my handwriting next to his, side by side on the paper, the way our lives had run side by side on this land without either one of us fully realising it at the time. I added what I'd learned that Grover hadn't lived long enough to write down himself, Purcell's numbers on the moisture readings, the names of the men who'd come asking, the date Newsom signed the contract, the quiet Sunday afternoons with Arlie walking the rows. I never told anyone I'd been right. I never needed to. The land had already said it, plainer than I ever could, in green leaves standing up through a summer that killed everything around them, and in the sound of trucks pulling up my drive that used to only bring men come to laugh. You reap what you sow. My daddy used to say that over supper, over broken machinery, over a bad year and a good one both, and I used to think it was just a thing. Old farmers said to make peace with whatever the weather had done to them that season. I understand it different now. It isn't a comfort you say after the harvest, it's a promise you make before you ever put a seed in the ground. A promise that what you plant in patience will still be standing long after the folks who laughed have forgotten they ever doubted you. Find, if somebody left you a notebook, a letter, find a half-finished plan you don't fully understand yet. Don't be too quick to set it aside because it doesn't look like what everybody else around you is doing. Find, sometimes the ones who came before us saw further than we give them credit for. Find, tell me down in the comments what your own people left behind. The small thing nobody else believed in, and if it ever proved itself out the way mine did. I'd like to hear it. Find this is the back 40, the land they rode off, and the ones who never stopped listening to it.